Have you ever thought, I don't know how I would survive if this or that ever happened? Well, here's how. These are the stories of how people just like you and I have gone through difficult life events and survived. It's a journey of faith, hope, and yes, the power of love. Here is the survival guide for the non-survivor. And hi there, welcome along once again. My name is Greg Fish. It's a pleasure to have you along with us here on the survival guide. You know, the pandemic just cut a swath across our landscape, and I even had my go around with COVID. I got mine near the beginning of it, spent about a month, actually only 2 weeks sick, but 2 weeks because they didn't know what to do with me after I'd been sick. So they said, just kind of stay inside. But along the course of things, a lot of folks got really sick, and we got used to hearing these stories. In fact, I think every one of us is connected with a story of somebody who did not survive COVID. And today's guest is somebody who we didn't think was going to survive, and then he did. And he's a great friend of mine. In fact, he was my pastor when in the middle of my career in radio, I made a transition into pastoral ministry. In fact, it's pretty much this man's fault. No, it's not. That I was in pastoral ministry. Here is Pastor Chet Martin. Pastor Chet, thank you so much for coming along today.
Well, hi, Greg. It's very good to be with you.
And that story is definitely, I mean, when you found out I had this calling into ministry, you just wouldn't let it go. And your encouragement really helped me to see that's where I needed to be.
Well, it was pretty obvious to me. And then I got to observe you actually at work as a pastor yourself and was very proud of your work.
Well, I thank you so much, Chet. When I heard that you were in the condition you were in, my heart was broken because I thought I just wanted to speak to this man one more time, and I probably won't have that opportunity. And I do have that today. So let me just start with kind of the beginning of the story. Tell me about getting sick and the realization that you were going to have to go to the hospital.
Well, we had been so careful at the church and at home in our private life all during 2020. Avon was the first town in Indiana, and that's where I was pastor at, that had a COVID case. And in fact, the schools closed and the churches closed. And then in May of 2020, we started holding outdoor services, and all of our services at the church were in the parking lot for the rest of the year. And we were keeping distance from one another. And Dawn and I would even have our children and grandchildren over to the house and stay 6 feet away from them and meet out in the yard and do things like that. And as winter came on, of course, we had to move back inside, but we were still really careful. But at a church event near the very end of the year, I ended up being exposed to COVID. And it was about a week before people of my age were eligible to get the first vaccination in Indiana. Okay. So I hadn't had the chance to do that or anything like that. But as I say, it was very near the end of December. On January 3rd, I remember this precisely because that was on Sunday, we held our service and had decided with the council of our administrative leaders to actually hold that online and broadcast it that way, to stream it so as not to risk people being exposed to COVID who had gone away for Christmas, etc. Mm-hmm. So I remember that it was on Sunday, and we did everything from the sanctuary of the church, went home. I had a little part-time job teaching English for an online high school, and I was grading papers. And my wife was watching a football game, but I wasn't watching that one. But I started coughing. And I coughed several times, and I looked over at my wife, Dawn, and I said, um, you know, this isn't a normal cough for me. I had a cough that was caused by my blood pressure med, but that wasn't the same thing. And I remember saying to her, I think I have it. The next morning, I called my doctor's office, and I know if I call him real early that he sometimes answers the phone himself. So I called him real early and told him what the symptoms were. And he said, well, I'm sure you do have it, but you'll probably be okay. But if your blood oxygen level drops under 92, go to the emergency room. Well, we went and bought whatever we needed to have to keep track of that blood oxygen level. And when mine dipped under 92, I didn't want to go to the hospital, like a lot of people. And so I kept trying to treat myself at home. I stayed isolated in the bedroom, and we have a bed that tilts up. And so I sat up and slept in an upright position, and actually just kept getting worse. And my wife would check my blood oxygen level even through the night. And on Tuesday night, Wednesday morning, mine had dropped all the way to 61.
Wow.
And we decided that if it didn't go back up on Wednesday, that I had to go to the hospital. And so by Wednesday evening, it hadn't gone any lower, but it hadn't really gone any higher. So Dawn took me to the hospital, and back then, no one was allowed to go into the hospital with you. And so she had to drop me off at the emergency room entrance, and it was probably one of the worst moments of my life, if not the worst, because I was telling her goodbye there outside the hospital. Who had also heard all the stories, the first lady in Indiana who passed away from COVID, I knew her. She was a member of one of our other churches here in town. And I didn't know if I'd ever see my wife again, and I didn't know if I'd ever see any of my children again. And so she had to say goodbye and leave me, and I went in, and I had a long wait in the emergency room, waiting room, and I sent out texts to my kids and stuff like that. And they finally took me back to a room, and I was in the emergency room for the next 24 hours because the hospital was so full, primarily of COVID patients. And they told me that, yes, I had COVID. The test showed that, but they thought that I had the best case of anybody. Now, I since have come to the opinion, and it's only an opinion, I think they were telling me that to try to keep my spirits up. Because every step along the way, they said, well, yeah, we have to move you up to the progressive care floor, but you're still the best one on the progressive care floor. And we have to put you in intensive care, but everyone else in here is sicker than you are. And then about 6 days after I went to the hospital, 5 or 6 days, they told me that they were going to have to put me on a ventilator. And so I remember sitting in the bed, the doctor talking to me, and I said, Doctor, am I going to die? And he said, I hope not. And that was the best that he would say. I asked him if he changed his mind and he thought I was going to die, would you let me see my wife and children? And he said that he would take care of that. He was very gracious about that. And then I was intubated. And what I'm going to tell you about being intubated all comes from other people, because from that moment on, I have no memory until I started to wake up from it.
Okay.
I know some people say that they remember hearing things, and I don't. I have no memory from that point on. And after I had been placed on the ventilator. 2 or 3 days later, they called my wife and told her that I might not make it through the day, that things were going to go, I don't know what they were doing, but things were going to go one way or the other. And if they went one way, that'd be good. But if it went the other way, then it could go pretty fast. And I know she asked them, we have one daughter who lives in southern Michigan, and she asked if she would have time to get here. And he said yes, but I would call her now. And so that was the first day that my family gathered together, thinking that I might not make it through the day. After that, I don't believe my wife could answer the phone when it was from the hospital. I think from that point on, she had asked them to call our son, Zach, and he was the one who fielded the calls and passed on the information. After that day, when I obviously survived and came through that day, then it was maybe less than a week later that the same thing happened. And it was virtually the same message, that something is going to go one way or the other today. And if it goes well, okay. And if it doesn't, it could be very fast. And part of that was my situation was exacerbated by the reality that I had pneumonia 4 separate times when I was in the hospital. And I don't mean 4 bouts of COVID pneumonia. I mean, I had other pneumonia 4 times.
Okay.
It came from the damage that the COVID pneumonia was doing to my lungs. And I ended up being on that ventilator for almost 6 weeks, which in my anecdotal conversations with people, I haven't heard of hardly anyone who was on a ventilator that long. But I was.
And I assume by this point, I assume you were on a trach as well?
Oh, yes. When they put me on the ventilator, they intubated you can't see the scar real well, but it's right there. And so the machine was breathing for me, and they would turn my body. The only movement that I had was they would turn me to where I was laying on my stomach for a shift, and then I would go to laying on my back for a shift. And I've seen pictures of myself, and I looked, it's pretty grim. It's pretty sobering to see that. At some point, they allowed Dawn and the children to talk to me via FaceTime. The nurses put an iPad up in front of me, and Dawn and the kids talked to me, and I have no memory of that at all. But they did that, and I do want to say that in all of my experience in that whole year, and it ended up being 3 different hospitals and a nursing care facility, the healthcare professionals were absolutely wonderful. I think they were very attentive to my needs, and I know people have a lot of criticism about some of the things that were done or not done with COVID patients, but I have no criticism because I would not be here if they had not cared so greatly for me. So I was on that for about 6 weeks. Wow. And somewhere in that, the COVID obviously went away. And then the big challenge was getting me off of the medications and everything that flowed from being on the ventilator. I also was placed on kidney dialysis at that time, and that plays an important part in my story later. One of the doctors told my son, and for your audience, my son's also a pastor. One of the doctors told my son that your dad's kidneys have died, and he will have to be on dialysis for the rest of his life. And Zach looked right back at the doctor and said, well, I don't believe that at all. And I'll tell you later how that turned out. So.
Okay. So, well, we hear other people's stories through the filter of our own stories. And one of the things that's starting to build in my mind as you tell me this is the time that you came along beside me when my wife, Barbara, who eventually passed away, was in the hospital for 8 months as I was pastoring under your leadership as then superintendent. And I don't remember exactly what you told me during that time, but I remember it was always very comforting and what I needed to hear. What during that time were people speaking into the life of your family that really seemed to be the most helpful to them in dealing with the situation as it was?
Well, I don't know if I can give you a really accurate answer because, of course, I wasn't there. I know that the church rallied around my family. They were, and I mean the local church that we're a part of, and the conference we're a part of, and the denomination. And I know that they were there and encouraged and comforted my family. My son was working as an associate when I became ill for me, and he had to take over as the pastor. And so he became not only the full-time support for his mom and his sisters, but also was leading the church. And the church prayed so hard for me. I was born on October 1st, and some young lady in the church got the idea that at 10:01 to commemorate my birthday, that they would meet in the parking lot of the hospital and pray for me.
Wow.
And they did that. And I know that the Light and Life congregation prayed and prayed. I know one day when the call went out that it was a very critical day, one lady told me that she just fell into a chair and just prayed as hard as she had ever prayed, because it was so important to them. I know that the pastors of my conference prayed, and that the superintendent sent out lots of requests. And I know that our board of bishops prayed whenever they talked on the phone, whenever they met in person, they prayed for me. And all across the United States, Free Methodists, and there aren't that many of us, but all across the United States, Free Methodists prayed for me. And then that went around the world. And I know that there are little churches in Malawi that might meet under trees, but they prayed for the big chubby white guy who came over there one time. And I just appreciate that so much. And others, the church in the Philippines, the church in Chile, and I couldn't even tell you where all. People prayed for me. And then people in town, in other churches, people I didn't know, had never met, they started praying for me. The church paid my salary every 2 weeks, just like always, even though I was doing nothing for them. They paid my salary. And when it came to a point that it was time to give them some relief and move me on to an insurance provision that would pick up my salary, there was 1 month that the annual conference paid my entire salary for the month. And so I know that one thing was that Dawn, my wife, never had to worry about finances. The church. So there's two things. The church prayed.
They prayed.
The church gave generously. And now as to words of encouragement, I don't know. I'm sure that Dawn and Zach and Katie and Emily were encouraging each other. And I'm sure that the church did that as well.
So what is the first memory you have then of coming out of COVID?
Well, it's funny you should ask that. My wife and I were talking about this just this week. My first memory that I have that I guess would indicate that I was still alive was I kept having this dream, and at first it was a really nice dream. Later dreams were not, but the first one, I had this dream that for some reason I thought I was in China, and I thought I was in a missionary's home, and I had gotten very, very sick. But my son was there with me, and even while I was sick in bed, he was reading to me. And
Hmm.
when they allowed family to start coming back in, after I had been removed from the ventilator or was being removed intermittently from the ventilator, they started letting me have company. Zach would come in and he would read to me. I was reading a Tolkien novel before I got sick, and he found that on my desk and just brought it in and picked up from the page where I had left off and read aloud to me. And I guess that was the first hint that I had that I didn't know that that meant I was still there. I didn't remember that I had had COVID. And I don't know when that happened. Um, they tell me that I did sometimes seem to indicate that I knew who they were. One day when Zach came in, I called him the same thing that I had called him when he was a little boy. So that was very significant to him. But I don't know. I don't have a lot of clear memories about that. When I
Sure.
went from
Sure.
the main hospital that treated me for COVID, I had to go to a rehab hospital, and then I had to go to a third rehab hospital. And I tell people, to summarize it, January and February, I mainly slept. March, I was mainly crazy. And April is when I started waking up.
And what do you
So,
mean by crazy? Mainly crazy.
uh, well, that pleasant dream morphed into dreams that actually were quite scary. I dreamed that I had been kidnapped. I was terrified. I thought I was being held in the basement of a big building. I think I had watched too many Criminal Minds episodes back before. Um, and I just every night it was terrifying, and I would forget that my family had been there because, Greg, and this sometimes makes me want to cry when I think about it. From the moment they could visit, there was never 5 minutes of my visitation time that I did not have someone with me. Now, it was
Hmm.
primarily my wife and my 3 children, and only one could come at a time, and only one per day. So whoever came had to stay there for like 6 hours. But they did. My mom even came once or twice. And yes, my mom's still alive, which, that meant that a much older person was there. My brother came a couple of times, but I was never alone. But I would never remember that when the visitation at that first hospital was from noon until 7, I believe. And they would leave at 7, and I probably went right to sleep. But then I would wake up around midnight, and when I woke up, I was back kidnapped, held in the basement, terrified. And I was a pain in the neck. I would cry out for help, and I know my daughter Katie went one day to the nurses and said, "I just want you to know that this is not what he's really like. He's really a very nice and kind person, but that's not what those people would have said about me at that time.
Wow. Wow.
I was not me. I didn't recognize." Well, one of my favorite stories also involves Katie. She came in to see me, and I said to her, who are you? And she told me that she was my daughter, Katie. And I said, well, I do remember that I have a daughter named Katie, and she kind of looks like you, but if it's really you, where did I take you when you were 4 years old? And what did you call it? And she says she was standing there praying, oh, Jesus, please help me remember what he's talking about. Because that had been 34 years ago at
Sure,
that.
sure. Yeah.
And I had taken her on the train to downtown Chicago, and we had gone to the top of the Sears Tower, which she called the Sirius Tower. And she remembered that. So then I knew
Okay.
it was her. Another day I told her that I had killed someone and I wasn't sorry at all. And she said, well, why did you kill them? And I said, because they killed one of my children and I'm not sorry. And she said, well, Dad, I'm one of your children and I know the other two are okay. So maybe that was just a dream. I think that was the day that they told the nurses to change my TV and never let it be on anything except, like Nickelodeon or
Yeah.
stuff like
Uh-huh.
that. But the dreams didn't necessarily fade away. I mean,
Mhm.
I was convinced that I had been in a room in the basement even after I started being more sensible. But my wife reminded me that there was a day when 10 of my 11 grandchildren came and were outside the window of my room. They could not really see in and see me, but I sat there and looked out and saw them, and I knew every one of them. I knew what their names were, and it was just a wonderful experience. But I forgot it by the time that night fell. So that's what I mean about being crazy for that
Gotcha.
month. And it
Now,
really didn't change until I went on to the third hospital, and Dawn and the girls had made 2 posters for me, and they put all of the kids' pictures, Dawn's picture, my mom's picture, our kids' pictures, and then the grandkid pictures on these posters, and they put them up on the wall, probably in both hospitals, but I only remember in the second one. And the first night I was there, I woke up in the middle of the night, and I was, again, sure I'd been kidnapped, but I was kind of flailing around in bed, and I felt the call button. And apparently Chet was coming back, because I remember thinking, well, now, kidnappers certainly would not give you a call button.
call button. Yeah.
So I pushed the call button, and 2 nurses swept into the room, and I said, where am I? And they told me where I was at, and one of them pointed out the posters on the wall. And from that point on, I know that every time I was confused or scared, I would look over there and I would think, okay, my family knows where I'm at, so I must be all right. And it was about then, Greg, or maybe a week later, that I also started praying again. Because all
Mm.
that time,
Mhm.
I don't know what interaction I might have had with the Lord when I was in the coma,
Right.
but the time that I was crazy, well, I know I prayed one day because I was so depressed. In the second hospital, I told Dawn, my wife, that I felt so bad, I just wanted to die. And she didn't know what to do, so she laid her head down on my shoulder and she started praying out loud that Jesus would take away my discouragement. And she says that at the same time, she started praying out loud that Jesus would help me feel better. I started praying out loud that Jesus would just let me die. And so I guess that was my
Well,
first prayer experience when I started waking up. But then in April at RHI, I started praying. And I remember one of the first days, I had actually seen a news report that told how many people had died of COVID in the time I was in the hospital. And I remembered by then that I had COVID, that I had had it. And I asked Jesus why I didn't die. I really wanted to know the answer to that. And Greg, just as clearly as I have ever heard the Lord say anything to me, not in an audible voice, but in a voice through his Spirit that I have no doubt in, he said, because so many people were praying for you.
Wow.
And I believe that he also said that he wants me to tell that story every opportunity I get. So people probably are tired of me. I tell people in restaurants, I tell people at gas stations, I tell at any store I go to, I try to tell everyone that I get the opportunity. If there's the slightest bit of an open door, I try to tell them, because I want them to know that when we pray, God does sometimes do miracles. A lady in
Yes.
our church
Yes.
here at Light and Life, and your listeners may want to know that, by the way, your sister and her family go to this church. I've actually had the privilege of being the pastor for lots of people in your family.
Right.
And
Right.
a lady that Stephanie knows really well, a nurse here who was in that first hospital, she says she tells people now my story because she said there's no medical explanation for my pastor having lived. And
Yeah.
that means that prayer works. And that's what I want to tell people, that and it wasn't even my prayer, but it was people praying for me, and it worked powerfully. So in this April hospital, the last one, I was still on dialysis. Dialysis for me was a very depressing experience. A lot of people say that it drains your energy. Well, it probably did, but at that point I couldn't move, Greg. I couldn't sit up. I could move one arm. I could move this arm. This arm, I could maybe move that high. I could move my neck. I could not, my legs, I had no control.
Mm.
And I was just bedfast and very discouraged. And then the dialysis would make it worse. And one Sunday, my aunt called me, and she said that she had had what she thought was a vision from God. Now, my aunt has been a Christian my whole life, but my aunt has never told me ever about having a vision from God before this moment. And the fact that it wasn't what she claimed to experience all the time made it actually seem more real to me. She said that she had had a vision that God put his hands into my body and touched my kidneys. Well, the next day, and I'm not, this is not preacher exaggeration, this is the absolute truth. The next day, the kidney specialist that I saw every day came in the room and said, "You know, your numbers don't look very bad today. We're going to let the dialysis go until tomorrow, and we'll see how you look then." I never had dialysis again. I
Wow.
was the
Praise God.
10th, they tell me, in that kidney practice, the 10th person to ever come off dialysis. They took the port out, and I've never had it. And I just was at a kidney doctor a few weeks ago, and everything's very stable and looking good. And so I mean, it was like two health miracles in that span of time. I was so discouraged about ever being able to get up and walk again. When I came home at the end of April, um, had to come in a wheelchair, had to have a wheelchair ambulance, had to have a what's called a Hoyer lift, which is kind of like a
Mm-hmm.
hammock on, well, you've probably used them. So it's a
Right.
hammock kind of deal. And I had to be on a Hoyer lift to get out of my bed, to get into a lift chair. And my life was lived in either the bed or the lift chair. And that was, again, pretty discouraging. But my wife and kids just kept telling me how much I had improved. Every time I said, I can't do something, one of my kids would say, "You can't do it yet." And that was encouraging. I mean,
Yes.
they believed
Wow.
when I could not believe. In, I don't know how far into this you want me to go, but in June, I actually had to go back to the hospital because
Mhm.
the first COVID, not the variants that came later, but the first one, the one that the doctors call the nasty one, it not only attacked your lungs, it seemed to attack lots of other things as well. And in the middle of June, I had to go back to the hospital with what we thought was a terrible kidney infection. And they pumped me full of an antibiotic when I got there that they said was one of their most powerful ones. But it wasn't a kidney infection. It was a gallbladder that had become so toxic, it was too
Mhm.
toxic to even be removed. They had to put a stent in it so it would drain to the outside of my body because they were afraid if they tried to remove the gallbladder that the sepsis would go throughout. And again, now I'm back in end of June, beginning of July, and they're telling me that my life could be lost over that as well. In fact, I sometimes wonder if that my daughter-in-law thinks that was the scariest time, and I wonder whether the hospital thought so too, because they allowed like 12 people into the waiting room right before I went back for this procedure, and they just don't do that if they think you're going to be coming right back out. So had that happen, ended up being in the hospital again for weeks, and from there I couldn't come home. I went to um, a nursing care facility.
And this is in 21, right?
This is all 21. So
Okay.
from January to, well, I'm going to say from January to October 1st, my birthday. So that would be 9 months. I was in the hospital 6.5 of them, or the nursing home. I just, I was in such bad shape. But during that last part, um, right before I had the gallbladder problem, and then I started having some home health care therapists who were wonderful. I mean, they were absolutely so good. And they worked with me, got me up. They, I had to go back and have the gallbladder removed, but they picked up with me right when I got back from that surgery, and they worked so hard and helped set goals with me. What were your goals? Well, I want to be able to take a shower because I hadn't had one without. Well, I guess I did in one of the hospitals. They helped me, but I hadn't had one at home. And so we worked really hard to get me into the shower. And I remember I had this young lady who was my occupational therapist, and she was helping me. And I told her, she said, "Okay, tomorrow we're going to take a shower." And I said, "Okay, but I'm going to wear my swimming trunks," because I was embarrassed about being naked in front of her. But so I was in there in my swimming trunks, and she was standing outside the curtains, making sure I don't fall or anything. And I called out and I said, "You know what? With these swimming trunks on, I can't wash the parts that I really want to wash." And so I just dragged them off and threw them out. And I said, probably 100 people have seen me already in the hospital. I'm not going to worry about you. And she said, "Well, I thought that you would come to that conclusion at some point." So she how to take a shower. They taught me how to go down. We only have 2 steps in our house down to the family room. And they taught me how to get down those 2 steps, taught me how to get in a car. They worked with me. They knew I wanted to go fishing again someday. They worked with me on being able to thread the hook and the line, and those little tiny things were very hard. because the fine motor skills were just decimated. But they worked and taught me all of that. And during that time also, I started very diligently trying to go up to other people that I saw at the rehab hospital that were in rehabilitation therapy themselves. I tried to go up to them and tell them how far I had come and encourage them and promise to pray for them. And some of them I still pray for to this day. Those therapists, they were just wonderful people, and they worked hard. And now, Greg, I've probably peaked in recovery. I don't know that I'll ever walk much better than I walk now. And if you saw me walking without any help, you'd think that I was trying to imitate Frankenstein's monster or something like that.
Mm.
Pretty lurchy. But I use a cane most of the time. I use my walker sometimes. And I go pretty much wherever I want to go. And it was such an effort to get into my car, my wife's car. But now I drive my Ford F-150 pickup truck. And getting into it is a little tricky. I have to have a stool that I step on and then step in. But I drive, and God has given me back so much of what I thought was gone forever. There's no way I could say thank you to him enough. And the key behind the only part that we did was my family and friends prayed. You prayed for me, and people like you all across the world prayed for me. And I worked hard with the therapists, and I relied upon the faith of other people too, because I didn't have the faith that I would get up and walk again. But my wife and children did, and the therapists did. And I relied upon their faith. And God just checked in such a big way for me.
And you just recently returned from a fishing trip to one of your favorite spots, Reelfoot Lake. And how did that go?
Went great. I went there last year too.
Did
And
you?
so last year, it took a lot of effort to get me in the boat. But this year, just a little effort. I just needed a little tiny bit of help. And again, I've mentioned my children, my two oldest grandchildren, Ethan and Andrew, they have just been so caring and wonderful for me. And one of them, the first year, Andrew went fishing just to make sure that he could help me get in the boat. He doesn't even like fishing that much, but he went to do that. And this year they both went. And again, they are right on me. If they see me moving and they think that I might need any help, it's like I'm a mafia guy with two bodyguards on either side of me. They're my Secret Service team. One time I was walking into the Light and Life Church, and I was walking in with a cane, but I was walking, and I have a little bit of trouble, or used to have more than I do now. I dragged my foot and I just fell. I fell right to the floor. Zach was right behind me, and then Ethan was not too far on the other side. And before I knew it, the two of them and Dawn had helped me up, and Zachary is whispering in my ear. He says, "No, this is not as big of a deal as you think it is." And he was worried that I was going to be really embarrassed. And I might have been if he hadn't said that. But the other thing I thought right away, I'm being helped to walk by two men that I helped learn to walk and picked up many times when they fell. And there's something just really beautiful about that.
And I'm wondering too, over the years as a pastor, you have helped many, many people who were in times of trauma. And you did the best that you could with what you had to speak God into their life. How has this changed the way you approach people who are now suffering or in trauma?
Well, one thing I think that I knew all along in all of those years of helping people, that it never does any good to pretend that bad stuff isn't bad. And so, when I would come to the hospital with you and Barb, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I'm sure I never said, well, you're going to be up and out of here next week. It's all going to get better. Because, too often it doesn't all get better.
Right.
And I guess the big thing that my experience with COVID has done for me is that things that I said to people theoretically, I now can say experientially. I know this to be true. I know you're going to be scared. And I was scared. I was scared to die. Here I am, a pastor and a Christian for decades. I was scared to die. I was not scared of being dead. And that's a very different thing. I was not frightened of seeing Jesus, but I was frightened of being alone and having to do something that I had never done before. And and grieving because, when you're in that situation, I'm not talking about after I was on the ventilator, but I'm talking about those days before. And I was just grieving the fact that I would probably never see my children again. I've got all of the text messages that I sent back and forth to them and to others still on my phone. And every now and then I go back and read those. I don't know if that's altogether good for me, but sometimes I just feel like I have to. And I confess to them regularly that I was scared. And they always encouraged me. When in August, so long after the COVID, and even long after the gallbladder, I knew that I was getting better in August. My daughter Emily posted a video on Marco Polo, which is like a video texting app. And it was of her children, and I wanted to watch it, so I went on looking for it. But I'm not super tech savvy, and I never found the one that she posted that day. But I found one that she posted the first day that they called her and told her that she needed to come home. And she said, Daddy, I don't know if you'll ever get to see this. I hope you do, but I don't know if you will. But I'm sitting here remembering that when I was growing up, you always told me that I didn't have to go through anything by myself, that Jesus would always be there with me. And she said, I want you to remember that now, that you're not going through this alone, that Jesus is right there in the room with you right now. And I hope I never accidentally delete that video, because it just means everything to me.
So surviving day to day now, I'm sure you still have, as you mentioned, some of the ramifications of what you went through, but how is your joy these days? How is your walk with the Father these days, Chet?
I'm almost ashamed to say this, Greg, but better than when I was a pastor, because my time with the Lord today is not geared toward writing a sermon for Sunday. It's not geared toward anything except my personal walk with Him. And I have a great time in the Word every day and in prayer every day, and listen to a couple of different daily devotionals, and all of those things just enrich my soul. And I see so many changes in me. I am the most thankful man I have ever been. I'm thankful for everything. I'm thankful after you and I are done on this day, I have a little outdoor project that I'm going to go. My dog dug some holes in the front yard, and I bought some topsoil to go out, and I'm going to fill those up and pack them. And I am thankful that I get to do that, because I almost got to do nothing. I go to a kid's band concert or soccer game or whatever I go to for them, and I am so thankful that I am here to do that. I love my time with my wife. The Lord has blessed me so much since 2021, since I was sick. We haven't even mentioned this. I don't even know if you know this, but from August 2022 until this spring, May, I actually taught part-time at the local Avon High School, where I think your nephew and nieces all graduated from.
Okay. Yeah, I think I heard something about that. Yeah.
Yeah, they were asking for a part-time person who could actually not teach a class, but help students with their English classes. And if you happen to have a teaching license, that'd be great. Well, I do have an English teaching license in Indiana. And so I went and took that job, and I was so thankful for the chance to work with kids again, because I had loved that. I did that before I was a pastor, and I loved it then. I loved it again, loved working with kids. And even though there's such a, you just can't bring up a lot of stuff in the public school setting, almost every class period, at some point, someone would say to me, "Mr. Martin, what did you do before you came to Avon?" And I happened to work in the same room as a lady who goes to the Avon church. And I said, "Well, I was Mrs. Handlin's pastor for 14 years. And then they would ask me about that. And then I would get to tell them that I was alive and they're teaching them because people had prayed for me. And I mean, I did not water down that message at all when they asked. I never brought it up until they asked. But when they opened the door, I told them what Jesus had done for me.
One final question for you, and just to kind of bring this all together now to a fine point. If somebody says to you today, "Pastor Chet, I just don't know how I'm going to make it through this," realizing every situation is unique, what's the first thing that comes to your mind to say to them?
Well, I guess the very first thing is the same thing that Emily told me. If you're trying to go through this alone, you probably can't. But if you commit yourself to going through this, holding on to the hand of Jesus, who loves you more than anyone else has ever loved you, you will be able to survive. You will be able to overcome. He will help you no matter what's at the end. Whether I had lived or whether I had died, Jesus was with me. And he was never, ever, ever going to let me down. That's the first thing that I would tell them. And the second thing comes more from the physical rehabbing part of my coming back to health, is that all I had to do was do the best I could that day. When they would take me down to the rehab gym, and it was so hard, and I just couldn't hardly stand up, couldn't hardly walk with even all these machines and help they were giving me. I didn't have to get it all the way right that day. I just had to work as hard as I could that day. And so, you got to bite things up into little tiny pieces so that you can progress. So I think those would be the two biggest things, and also to just rely upon the people that love you, let them help you. My family was, everyone thinks their family's wonderful. I get that. and everyone should. I'm sorry for those who haven't experienced that, but my wife and children were the most wonderful that anyone could have been to me. Far more wonderful than I probably deserved. And just that love was healing too. So let people love you. Don't close yourself off from that. Sometimes we can hurt so much that we close ourselves off from the people who love us and want to help us. So.
And let me just say, I hope to be able to do a whole lot of these interviews over the times ahead, but this will be one that I absolutely treasured because you are such an important person in my life, in my formation, and in helping me to be the man that I am today. You are, for better or worse, a part of that. And I'm thankful. I am grateful. And I'm thankful to have this one more conversation with you here today.
Well,
and
I hope
again,
that
thank
we
you
have
for
a lot
what
more...
you have brought into my life, because you will never know exactly what that has meant to me. But to the degree I can tell you, thank you. This is a CORBINCAST podcast. And if you'd like to find out more about the CORBINCAST network, you can check us out at CORBINFosterMedia.com. That's CORBINFosterMedia.com. The URL should be right there for you. Be sure and subscribe and like and review these podcasts. Also, if you are watching on social media, we would love it if you would like and share these with others so that they can get this story as well. And also a CORBINCAST podcast that's available on all podcasting platforms as well as YouTube is Greg's Daily Blessing. If you would like to check in with my daily word to you, just a brief little story, sometimes a little nonsense, and a blessing for your day. Just if you need something good spoken into your day, be sure and check those out as well. Thank you so much for coming along for the Survivor Guide. My name is Greg Fish. Have a wonderful day.